I am not a man given to sentiment. I have kept ledgers for 31 years, managed 6 estates, overseen the movement of money, livestock, and obligation across 4 counties, and I have never once written a single line that was not required of me. What you are about to hear is not required. It is simply the truth as I saw it, and I write it now because I am old enough to know that the truth has a way of requiring itself eventually, that it accumulates in the silence you try to give it, until the weight of the unwritten becomes heavier than the writing. So I am writing. His name was Aldrich Vane, the Duke of Cresthollow. I served him for 17 years as his steward, his accountant, his occasional conscience, and when the circumstances genuinely demanded it, the man who stood between him and the decisions that grief was making on his behalf. He had been, in the years before this story begins, a capable and formidable landlord, the kind of man to whom a county defers without being entirely able to say why, because the combination of intelligence, restraint, and the quiet authority of someone who has never needed to raise his voice is a kind of power that works below the surface of things, like a foundation you only think about when the ground moves. He managed Cresthollow with a precision I admired, and I am a man who admires precision. He was also, and I say this from proximity, not inference, one of the loneliest men I have ever had occasion to observe closely. He would have disputed the word. He would have said he was simply a man with a great deal to manage, which was true. He would not have said the rest of it. That was not his way. His wife had died 3 years before this story begins. Her name was Isabel. She had been warmth itself, quick-minded and laughing, the kind of presence that makes a large house feel inhabited rather than merely maintained. And her death in the winter of the 3rd year of their marriage had taken something from him that did not announce its departure immediately, the way the structural damage from a fire sometimes takes months to become visible. He grieved in silence. He continued to manage the estate. He continued to ride in the mornings, to correspond, to conduct his affairs with the thoroughness that had always marked them. He attended what he was required to attend, and declined what he was not required to attend, and the list of what he was required to attend grew shorter every season, because no one quite liked to press him, and the grief, unaddressed, had taken on a gravity that people moved carefully around. I noted all of this. I noted most things about him. It was my function, and in some honest recess of the thing I am, it was also a kind of care. The woman arrived on the 3rd of November. I remember the day precisely because the first proper snow of the season had come the night before, just enough to whiten the lane from Ashfin village to Cresthollow's outer gate, to settle on the stone window ledges and frost the iron of the gate hinges, and catch in the evergreens along the drive in the soft, deliberate way of early snow that knows it is the first of many. The carriage that brought her was a hired one. A poor, mud-colored thing with a broken lamp bracket on the right side, the kind of conveyance you engage when you have already spent your pride on the necessities and have none left over for appearances. The driver set her trunk down on the gravel with the efficient indifference of a man completing a delivery, climbed back up to the box without speaking to her, and turned the horses before she had finished looking at the front of the hall. She stood beside her trunk in the light snow and looked up at the house. I had been warned of her arrival by a letter from one Barnabas Treve, a creditor and man of business in Whitmore who was not the kind of man who enters a room without first looking to see what he might borrow, and who had a talent for the legal that expressed itself, in practice, as an expertise in finding exactly what a document permitted him to do and doing precisely that and nothing else. He had written to inform me that as a condition of the debt settlement recently executed against one Mr. Crale of Ashfin, a gentleman of large enthusiasms and modest discipline, as I later understood him, his daughter, Miss Elspeth Crale, would be arriving at Cresthollow Hall to serve in the household for a period of 12 months. Her father had agreed to this arrangement in lieu of the remaining sum owed to Treve and Company. She was not a servant by profession or training. She was, in the bloodless shorthand of Treve's letter, a settlement, a transferred obligation. I showed the letter to His Grace. He was standing at the desk in the library when he read it. He rarely sat when reading things that required him to decide something, as if the act of sitting made a decision feel more permanent than he was prepared for it to be. He read it without expression, set it on my desk, and said, "See to it, Penrose." Then he left the room without looking at the letter again. So I saw to it. I had Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, a woman of 22 years' service in the household and the particular discretion that long service in great houses develops, prepare the blue room in the east wing. Not the servants' quarters, which would have compounded the indignity of the arrangement to no practical purpose. Not the formal guest rooms, which required a kind of presumption I was not yet warranted. The middle, a room that was clean and well appointed, with a hearth that drew properly and a window that looked east over the kitchen garden and the open fields beyond. I told Mrs. Fenn only what she needed to know, that Miss Crale was a gentlewoman temporarily in the household's employ. Mrs. Fenn looked at me with the expression she used when she believed she was being told something incomplete but had decided to accept it professionally, and went to prepare the room. That was how I came to be standing at the front door when the hired carriage pulled away and left Elspeth Crale standing alone on the gravel. She was not what I had prepared myself for. I had been braced for someone diminished, someone whose passage through the machinery of debt and her father's failures had left visible marks, the way a wet season leaves marks on stone. What I saw was a young woman of perhaps 24 or 25, dark-haired, dressed in a gray wool traveling cloak that had been carefully maintained and was beginning now to show the limits of care, the seams holding but the fabric worn in places where friction had asked too much of it. Her face was not plain, not striking. Still, that was the quality I arrived at, standing in the cold doorway while she looked up at Cresthollow Hall. Stillness, not the stillness of suppression, not the blankness of someone who has learned to show nothing because nothing has been safe to show, but the genuine stillness of a person who has done the interior work of settling herself and does not require the world around her to be still in order to maintain it. She heard the door and turned. "Mr. Penrose," she said, not a question. She had apparently done her reading about the household before she arrived. "Miss Crale," I said, "welcome to Cresthollow. Come inside before the cold takes proper hold." She moved to pick up her trunk, not to signal that it needed picking up. She had simply assessed what needed to happen and was acting on the assessment. She took one end of the trunk, looked at me, and waited. I took the other end. We carried it in together. That was the first thing I noted about her. She did not wait to be helped. She simply made helping easy to offer. The Duke did not meet her for 4 days. This was not unusual in those years. He moved through the hall with the particular elusiveness of a man who is present in a place without being accessible to it. The evidence of him was everywhere. A chair not quite in its morning position, a book taken from a shelf and not returned to the exact right place, the smell of horse in the early mornings that told you he had ridden before the household was properly awake, the notes that appeared under the door of my office each day in his clear, precise hand, covering matters of estate management and correspondence and finance with a thoroughness that had not diminished even in the worst of the grief. He ate alone, in the small room off the library. He conducted his estate business in the library and his private correspondence in the room at the top of the north stair, a room that functioned, for all practical purposes, as a keep to which he had sole access, and from which notes were passed under the door but which was not opened from the outside without an invitation that was very rarely extended. Elspeth did not attempt to reach him. She spent the first day simply absorbing the geography of the East Wing, which she accomplished with a systematic thoroughness that Mrs. Fenn mentioned to me on the second morning with an expression I can only describe as professional respect with a slight edge of alarm. By the third day she was navigating the entire house without hesitation and had, apparently, already identified certain inefficiencies in the household's routines. Not the servants' work, which was well managed, but the larger organizational patterns of how the household operated, the way stores were rotated, the way the linen was counted and catalogued, the way the accounts were organized, which she had apparently found without being asked to find it, somewhat wanting. She did not make a complaint or a performance of any of this. She simply noted it to Mrs. Fenn, quietly, and asked whether it would be appropriate to make certain suggestions. Mrs. Fenn told her it would be appropriate to make those suggestions to me. She came to my office on the third afternoon, knocked, and made those suggestions. They were excellent suggestions, advanced in a tone that made clear she understood she had no authority to implement them but was offering them in case they were useful, and that she would not raise the matter again if they were not. I told her 3 of them were useful and I would see about them. I told her the 4th was already planned but had been delayed by the groundskeeper's retirement. She nodded, thanked me, and left. I sat for a while after she left, looking at the door she had closed quietly behind her, and felt the specific unease of a man who has made an arrangement he can justify on practical grounds, but cannot entirely defend on human ones. On the second morning, I noticed that the lamp in the corridor outside the library had stopped flickering. It had been flickering for 6 weeks. I had logged it in the maintenance accounts 4 separate times. The footman had attended to it twice without solving the problem, and I had stopped pressing the matter. When I examined the lamp more closely, I saw it had been taken down, the wick properly trimmed, and the fitting receded and hung back. I asked Mrs. Fenn. She had not directed anyone to attend to it. She had, she said, observed Miss Crail at the lamp bracket the previous afternoon with a small cloth and what appeared to be a pair of fitting tools she had located in the kitchen. I mentioned it to the Duke in passing the following morning, because I mention most things to him. It is my function, and he expects it. He looked up briefly from his correspondence and glanced toward the corridor in question, where the lamp was burning with a steadiness it had not achieved in 6 weeks, and then returned to the letter in his hand without comment. I filed the look the way I file everything. On the 4th day, at shortly after 7 in the morning, earlier than his usual early hour, which was itself earlier than most, he came down the north stair, and she was in the corridor below. She was carrying a tray from the kitchen. Not because anyone had assigned her to carry it, she had, as she explained to me later when I asked, noticed that one of the kitchen maids was managing a strained wrist from a laundry accident the previous day, and had offered to take the morning service to the east sitting room herself, so the girl could rest the wrist until it was needed properly. She was looking at the tray rather than at the stair, as you do when you are carrying something that requires attention, and she nearly walked directly into the Duke. She stopped, her hands were entirely steady, the tray did not move. He looked at her. There was a pause of perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, the pause of a man who has encountered something he had not accounted for and is performing a rapid and careful recalibration. She looked up at him, not with the careful downward deflection of a woman who has been trained to avoid the gaze of powerful men, not with the performed deference of the skilled and subordinate. She looked up at him directly and waited, with the patience of a woman who has spent a great deal of her life waiting for the world to organize itself and has become exceptionally good at it. "Miss Crail," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He continued down the stair. She continued to the east sitting room with the tray. I watched them from the doorway of the morning room. I have a particular facility for that vantage, which has served me in 31 years of service, and felt something I cannot more precisely name than alertness. The specific, considered alertness of a man who has watched a household for a long time and has just seen something he has not seen before and cannot yet explain, and knows better than to try. November turned further into itself. The snow came in earnest, covering the grounds of Cresthollow and the village of Ashford below in the serious white of a northern winter that intends to make itself known. The kitchen fires burned from before dawn until after dark. Every corridor smelled of wood smoke and wax, and on the upper floors where the cold came through the old stone more directly, of something that was almost but not quite damp, the particular smell of a great house in winter that has been heating itself for 2 centuries, and has learned the trick of it but not entirely mastered it. He began to come down earlier. I noticed it within a fortnight. The hour at which he appeared at the foot of the north stair shifted, by 20 minutes at first, then by nearly 40. The east corridor, which Elspeth frequently used in the mornings for her various household purposes, was on his route between the stair and the library. Sometimes they crossed paths. Sometimes, when I tracked the timing afterward, they clearly did not. He had passed through the corridor at the hour he would have found her there, and she had already moved on. I noticed this and said nothing about it and continued to notice it. When they did encounter each other, the exchanges were brief and formally correct. Her name acknowledged, his title returned, occasionally a question from him about the household's operations, occasionally an answer from her that said what needed saying without elaboration. She never attempted to extend these moments. She never softened her posture in the way women are taught to soften their posture when they want to signal approachability. She spoke and then moved on with the same purposeful ease with which she did everything. I believe this was what held him. He had been for 3 years the object of a great many people's efforts to reach him, daughters brought on pretextual visits, invitations offered with the visible weight of hope behind them, guests who lingered in the rooms he passed through and arranged themselves in attitudes of welcoming availability, correspondence that began with the estate's business and ended with something warmer than the estate's business required. He was not unkind about any of it. He simply moved past it, the way moving water moves past a stone, noting it, touching it briefly and continuing without pause. He had become very precise at detecting the effort behind the ease, and the detection made him careful. With Elspeth Crail, there was no effort. There was simply a woman doing what needed doing, in a house that needed doing, with the competence and the unhurried certainty of a person who had made her peace with her circumstances at some earlier point and was not looking for them to be transformed. She did not position herself to be seen. She did not angle for his notice. She moved through the house with the same quality she had brought to the gravel drive that first morning. The stillness that is not blankness. That is the mark of a person who has done the interior work and does not need the exterior approval. He came to the library anteroom on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November. I was not there. She was alone, working at the long table beside the east window, the household accounts arranged before her in 3 ordered stacks with a 4th stack of her own notations to one side. The snow outside was falling in the slow, heavy, deliberate manner of snow that has decided to stay. The fire behind her was sufficient. The room was warm and quiet and smelled of paper and wood smoke, and the particular faint smell of old accounts that is not unpleasant if you have spent your life with them. He stopped in the doorway. She did not immediately hear him. He stood there for a moment. She told me this later, in the clear, precise way she told me things she wanted accurately understood, simply looking at what she was doing, at the ordered stacks, at the marginal notations in her careful hand. Then she looked up. She did not startle. She simply found him in the doorway and looked at him and waited. He said, "You've reordered the accounts." She said, "Yes. I found a more logical sequence by date and category combined. The previous arrangement mixed them in a way that made cross-referencing slower than it needed to be. If you prefer the original order, it will take me approximately an hour to restore it, and I'm happy to do that." He said, "What did you find in them?" There was a pause, the pause of a woman deciding how directly to answer a question that might be more direct than the questioner expected. And then she said, 3 transcription errors, 2 in the autumn livestock tallies and 1 in the timber record. They appear to be genuine errors rather than anything deliberate. I've marked each one with a note of what I believe the correct figure is. And there is one entry that appears to be a deliberate misdirection. A recurring expense shifted from the groundskeeping column to the general maintenance heading over the course of 18 months. It is not an enormous sum, but it is consistent and it was not accidental. I've flagged it separately. You may want to speak with Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale was the assistant groundskeeper. What Elspeth had identified was precisely what Mr. Hale had been doing with the estate's money for 18 months. Not a large theft by the standards of what a large estate handles, but a consistent one, and one that had escaped the notice of everyone including myself, which was not something I was comfortable with. He stood in the doorway for a moment after she finished, long enough to absorb what she had said, to calibrate the implication of it, to make whatever internal decision he made. He said, "Thank you, Miss Crail," and left. She told me about it that evening, the matter-of-fact way she told me most things, without performance, without the angling for a reaction that the information might have justified. She framed it as a practical question. She was uncertain whether she had overstepped. Had it been appropriate for her, given the nature of her arrangement in the household, to raise the matter of Hale's accounts? Or had she interfered in something that was not hers to raise? I told her she had done the right thing. She nodded once, the particular nod of a person who has suspected the correct answer and wanted it confirmed before she rested, and returned to her book. I sat for a long time after she left, looking at the fire in my grate. I thought about what it means when a person who has been delivered to a house as a line item in another man's accounting still asks, as her first and instinctive question, whether she has done right by the household. Not by the Duke, not by me, by the household itself, the place, the institution, the thing she had been set in the middle of, and which she seemed to have decided, quietly and without announcing the decision, that she had some obligation toward. December arrived with a cold that had permanence in it, the cold of a season that knows it has the territory now and is not concerned about being displaced. The frost came before dawn and stayed until midday. The roads to Ashfin were passable but not comfortable. The Duke's correspondence arrived by the weekly post and went out the same way, and the house settled into the particular rhythm of a northern winter that has found its own pace and intends to keep it. He began to speak to her. Not at length, length was not his idiom under any circumstances, but with substance. Where before their corridor encounters had produced an exchange of names and nothing additional, they now produced, with increasing regularity, sentences, questions, answers. On one occasion, on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December, a disagreement that lasted the better part of a corridor and resolved itself in nothing but mutual acknowledgement that both positions had merit, which in a man of his particularity was something very close to a concession. He asked her once what she was reading. She was in the library anteroom with the natural history volume she had taken from the shelves with Mrs. Fenn's permission, a comprehensive survey of the northern counties' geology, flora, and fauna published the previous decade by a naturalist of some reputation. She told him. He said he had read it some years ago and had found the second volume superior in its treatment of the underlying geology. She said she had found the second volume technically thorough at the expense of clarity, and that the first managed a better balance between precision and the kind of prose that made the subject accessible to a reader who was not already a specialist. He said that the second volume's technical rigor was its virtue, not its weakness, and that accessibility ought not to come at the cost of accuracy. She said that accuracy and accessibility were not mutually exclusive, and that the question was whether a writer wrote for the specialist who already knew the subject or for the intelligent reader who did not, and that the answer to that question ought to be visible in the book's intent from the first chapter. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has just had his own argument turned around and is assessing whether to dispute this. Then he said he would consider the point. She said that was all she had asked. He continued down the corridor. She told me about this one too, with something in her voice that I can only describe as the particular quality of a person who has been taken seriously and is still slightly surprised by it. There was another exchange, in the second week of December, that I did not witness, but which Mrs. Fenn relayed to me because she had overheard it from the corridor and found it, in her words, interesting enough to mention. He had come to the dining hall for the first time in some weeks, apparently without particular intention of staying, and found her there at the long table with the estate's correspondence that I had asked her to sort by county and date. She had been sorting since after breakfast. It was nearly the dinner hour, and she had made considerable progress. He had, Mrs. Fenn said, stood in the doorway for a moment, then come in and sat at the far end of the table, not close to her, not in a way that announced itself, and pulled one of the sorted stacks toward him and begun to look through it. They had worked at opposite ends of the long table for nearly an hour without speaking, except for 3 brief exchanges in which he asked her about the filing logic she had used. She explained it, and he asked one clarifying question each time and accepted the answer without dispute. When the dinner bell sounded, he had stood and said, "You've done this well. Not Miss Crail, just you have done this well." She had said, "Thank you." He had left. Mrs. Fenn told me about this with the expression of a woman who has been watching the same closed door for 3 years and has just observed it standing very slightly ajar. I said nothing about it, as I said nothing about most of what I was accumulating, but I noted it with the precision of a man who has learned that the things worth noting are often the small ones. A lamp fixed, a cord of wood sent, an hour at opposite ends of a table without the need for conversation to justify the proximity. He asked her another morning about her father. She answered him plainly, without deflection, and without the performance of unconcern that people use to indicate that something does not hurt when it does. She said her father was a man of tremendous enthusiasm and genuine warmth, who had simply never developed the corresponding discipline, and had made and lost 3 modest fortunes in her lifetime through a combination of optimism and inattention that was entirely characteristic, and that she bore him no particular anger, because anger required a sustained belief that things could have been otherwise, and she had made her peace with the shape of her life at an earlier point than most people made such peace. He said, "That is a gracious way to describe having been sold." She looked at him directly. "I am entirely aware of what the arrangement is, Your Grace. I find it is not improved by sentiment in either direction." He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man absorbing something that has landed differently than expected. He said, "No, I don't suppose it is." He left. She stood in the corridor in the brief privacy she thought she had, and I watched from my post near the morning room, and I saw something move across her face in that privacy. Something careful and considered. The expression of a woman who has been surprised by a conversation and is not yet certain what the surprise means, and is being scrupulous about not leaping to a conclusion before she has earned it. I noted it. Mrs. Fenn came to see me in my office on a Thursday evening in the second week of December. She had been in the household long enough to sit without being invited, and said, without preamble, "He is asking after her." I set down my pen. "Circuitously," she said. "On Tuesday he asked me whether the east wing heating was adequate. I said I believed so. He asked whether the blue room relied on its own hearth or received warmth from the main stack. I said both. He didn't pursue it, but he came back on Wednesday and asked whether Miss Crail had everything she needed for the weather. Not whether the east wing generally had everything, whether she specifically had everything she needed." She looked at me steadily. "He asked me this morning how she takes her tea." I said, "And how does she take it?" "Plain, a small amount of milk, no sugar." I told him. Mrs. Fenn's hands were folded in her lap in the way she held them when she had more to say, and was being careful about the order of it. "He also had a cord of wood cut from the west stand last week without my requesting it, and had it sent to the east wing. The blue room has been warmer than it's been in November in some years." She looked at me for a moment. "He hasn't asked about a household guest's comfort since the late Duchess was living," she said. "In 3 years, I mean, he hasn't asked." I sat with that. Mrs. Fenn stood, smoothed her skirt, and said, "I thought you should know," and left, which was her way of communicating that she was holding an opinion about the situation, but was keeping it where opinions that are not yet warranted are kept. I sat alone for a long while after that, looking at the middle distance, thinking about the specific gravity of a man who sends wood to a woman's room without telling her. There was, around this same time, a matter involving the north pasture drainage that I note here not because it was dramatic, but because it was characteristic, and the characteristic things are often the most important to record accurately. One of the northern tenants, a farmer named Caldwell who had held the boundary lease for 12 years, had written to the estate about a persistent flooding problem at the point where the Duke's drainage system met his land. It was not a new problem. I had it flagged in the records from 2 previous years, but the resolution had been delayed, first by the late Duchess's illness, and then by the years afterward, when the estate was managed with competence, but without the particular energy that a complex boundary drainage problem requires from the man at the top of the decision. The letter sat on my desk for 4 days, which was longer than it should have. She found it in the course of returning a ledger, which was, by now, a regular occurrence. She read it and said, "Is this the flooding problem at the north boundary?" I said it was. She said, "I walked that boundary 2 weeks ago when the snow had dropped low enough to see the ground. I can see the source of it. The secondary channel that carries the overflow east is silted at the junction point. There's a significant accumulation that's redirecting the flow back onto Caldwell's lower field. If the junction is cleared and the grade corrected, it should resolve both his flooding and the standing water in the Duke's lower pasture that I noted as a separate issue in the account log." She paused. "I didn't raise it separately because I wasn't certain whether it was appropriate, given my position in the household." I said that it was entirely appropriate and that she should have raised it. She said, "Then I think the letter should be answered promptly, and the channel work done before the spring thaw." She produced from the small notebook she had taken to carrying. Mrs. Fenn had registered the notebook with the mild, resigned bemusement she applied to most of Elspeth's practical habits. A pencil sketch of the drainage junction, the silting marked clearly, the proposed regrading indicated by dotted lines. It was not a professional survey drawing. It was the drawing of a person who observes accurately and translates what they observe with precision, and it was more useful than 3 paragraphs of description. I took the letter and the sketch to the Duke that evening. He looked at the sketch for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for comprehension, and then said, quietly, "She walked the boundary and drew this." I said yes. He said, "The standing water in the lower pasture has been a problem since summer. I had it logged but had not connected it to the north boundary drainage." I said she connected it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Have the channel work done before the thaw, tell Caldwell we'll attend to it." A pause, and thank her. She received the Duke's thanks with the practical satisfaction of someone who has identified a problem and seen it addressed, and with the brief, careful acknowledgement of a woman who is managing, with some deliberateness, what it means to her that the thanks came from him. I noted that too. I noted everything in those weeks. I could not help it. The third week of December brought a letter I had been dreading without quite knowing. I had been dreading it. It arrived on a Monday morning from Barnabas Treve, and it was not routine. It was a formal notification, precise, cold, written in the particular legal English of a man who is operating entirely within his rights and knows it, and takes a meticulous pleasure in doing so. He had identified, he wrote, additional outstanding obligations within the Crail estate's accounting. These obligations, now established and documented, triggered the extension clause in the original debt settlement agreement. He was therefore notifying the relevant parties that Miss Crail's period of service at Cresthollow Hall would be extended by 6 months beyond the original term, effective upon completion of the first year. He was within his rights. I had read the original contract with the specific care of a man who suspects a document of containing hidden rooms, and the extension clause was there, broad enough to admit through it nearly anything Treve chose to call a newly identified debt. It was legal. It was precise. It was also the first of what I had no doubt would be a series of such notifications, arriving at regular intervals, each one finding or manufacturing another debt, another extension, another year of a woman's life settled off against a balance she had had no hand in creating. I held the letter for 2 days. On the second evening, she came to my office to return an account ledger she had finished with. She had been working methodically through the older household accounts, going back 5 years, making notations of every discrepancy she found, doing thorough and unrequested work that I had started to feel, in the weeks she had been here, was something I could not take for granted as though it were merely what one expected of the situation. The letter was on my desk in plain view, and she read quickly. By the time I looked up from my own work, she had read it. She set the ledger down. She looked at the letter for a moment longer, not at me. Then she said, "Is this accurate?" I said, "I have not yet fully verified the specific accounting, but Treve's methods are." "Meticulous," she said. "Yes, I know. He was my father's principal creditor for 11 years. I know his method very well." She was quiet. "He will do this again. In 6 months he will find another debt. It will be smaller or it may be larger, but it will exist. And in 6 months after that, another one." She looked at the fire, not with resignation, but with the focused stillness of a person performing a very rapid and precise interior calculation. What she had, what she could bear, what this cost, what it would continue to cost. He will continue until there is nothing left to claim, or until someone stops him. I said carefully, "That is a risk I cannot, in honesty, discount." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire moved. She looked at it. Then she said, "Thank you for not hiding it from me." And she said it in the tone of a woman who has had things hidden from her, significant things, hidden for her own good, which is the particular cruelty of the well-intentioned, and who had made a practice of being genuinely, specifically grateful when someone declined to do that. She left. I sat alone with the letter for a long time. I looked at it as though looking at it long enough might change something it said. It did not. Then I took it upstairs to the room at the top of the north stair and slid it under the door. His Grace did not send a response that night, nor through the following morning. He rode out before 5 o'clock, long before his usual early hour, and was gone until the late afternoon. The weather was sharp and still, the kind of December day that is brilliant with cold and offers no distraction from whatever you have brought with you, and he rode hard toward the northern boundary of the estate where the trees thinned and the land rose, and there was nothing between you and the gray sky but wind and the suggestion of moorland beyond. I know the route because I traced it afterward from what was reported by the tenant at the North Farm and the groundsman near the boundary wall. He stopped nowhere for long, he simply rode. He returned in the late afternoon with his coat dark from the cold and his horse well worked, and he came directly to my office without removing his coat or his gloves, which was not how he usually arrived anywhere. He said, "I need Treve's original contract." I gave it to him. He sat at my desk. I stood. This is simply what one does without ceremony, and read the entire document with the thorough, unhurried attention he brought to documents that required him to act. He read it twice. He made 4 brief notations on a separate sheet of paper. He set the contract down with the precision of a man who has finished with a thing and will not need to return to it. He said, "What is the full amount of the Crail debt?" "Including Treve's claimed extension." I told him. I had calculated it that morning because I had known, watching him go out before dawn, that this would be the question. He was quiet for a moment. He said, and if the full debt is paid, the original sum and every claimed extension and every interest, the contract is discharged. By its own terms, I said. Full settlement releases the subject party from all further obligation. There is no residual claim. Treve cannot extend what no longer exists. He said, then I will pay it. I said carefully, Your Grace. He said, in full, immediately. I want the release document drawn and signed and returned within the week. Use Whitmore's solicitors, not Treve's. Treve's men will find a way to hook something into a release document. I don't want his name anywhere near the paper that dissolves his own claim. If you need to draft the release yourself and have Whitmore's men review it, do that. I want it clean, and I want it final, and I want there to be nothing in it that he can use. I said, you understand that this releases her from the arrangement entirely. She would be free to leave Cresthollow, free to go wherever she chose. There would be no further obligation on her part of any kind. He said, yes, Penrose, that is the point. He said it without impatience, and without the need to elaborate. He said it the way you say something that seems plain to you, and that you are stating only for the other person's benefit, simply and completely, and with no additional weight. He set his gloves on the edge of my desk, straightened, looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on his face in 3 years, not gladness, not yet, but something that had been shut and was cautiously, deliberately opening, and left. I sat at my own desk for a long while in the quiet he left behind. Then I pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward me and began to write. He did not tell her. This is the part I have thought about most often in the years since, and the part I find most precisely revealing about the kind of man Aldrich Vane actually was, underneath the formidability and the precision and the years of managed grief. He paid the debt. He had it done thoroughly, without shortcuts, with Whitmore's men reviewing every line of the release document before it was presented to Treve. He settled the Crail debt entirely, the original, the extension, the interest on both, and the release came back signed and legal and airtight. He filed it with the estate's papers. And he said nothing to her. Not a word, not a suggestion, not the smallest gesture toward acknowledgement. He continued to come down the north stair at his early hour. He continued the corridor exchanges that had by now become their custom, the brief particular conversations that were never quite as brief as they appeared on the surface, and covered more ground than the number of words would suggest. He continued, I knew from Mrs. Fenn, to ask occasionally whether she was comfortable, whether the blue room was adequate, whether the east wing was sufficiently warm. He attended to these small domestic concerns with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to the estate accounts. He did nothing that would cause her to guess. I asked him once, the week after the release document was filed, using the sideways approach that served best with a man who does not welcome direct inquiry, whether he intended to inform Miss Crail of the change in her circumstances. He looked at me with the level, considering expression he used when he believed I was working toward something I should simply state. He said, when the release document comes back from the solicitors, you'll give it to her. I said, and that is all, no explanation. He said, that's all. I said, she will ask who paid the debt. He said, tell her it was settled as an estate accounting matter. I said, Your Grace, she identified Hale's misdirected funds in 11 days. She spent 3 weeks reorganizing accounts that took me 2 years to lose track of. She will not believe it was an estate accounting matter. He looked at me. Something in his expression shifted, not discomfort exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been accurately understood and is deciding how to respond to the accuracy. He said, then tell her whatever you feel is honest, Penrose. You generally manage it. He left. I stood in the doorway of my office and watched him go down the corridor toward the library with his hands behind his back and his pace unhurried, and the particular quality in his bearing of a man who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. And I thought about what kind of person pays a considerable sum to free someone without telling them, expecting nothing, wanting nothing. Simply wanting the thing done, because it is what they deserved, and because the alternative was not something he was willing to continue looking at. The release document arrived on the 22nd of December. I waited for evening, when the household had settled and the fires were well attended, and the snow outside was doing its quiet, patient work. She was in the east sitting room with her book. I knocked twice, came in, sat in the chair across from hers, and set the document on the table between us without preamble. She read it the way she read everything, with her whole attention linearly, setting nothing aside. Her face did not move much while she read. It had more to say in the moments after. When she finished, she set the document on the table and looked at the table for a moment, then at me. "It's void," she said. "The contract, it's been discharged." "Yes." "The entire debt, including Treves' extension." "Yes." A pause. "By whom?" I looked at her, she looked at me. We had known each other for 7 weeks, in the particular way of two people who have dealt honestly with each other across small practical matters for long enough that the honesty has accumulated into something that functions almost like friendship, or at least like trust. She said again more quietly, "By whom, Mr. Penrose?" I said, "By a man who did not wish to be named in the transaction, and who has asked me to present it simply as a settlement." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the even, precise voice that was entirely hers, "The amount involved is not trivial. It could not be settled out of a household account without it being significant and without being decided by the person at the head of this household. And he would not have done it in exchange for anything." She looked at the document and then at me. "He freed me, without telling me, without asking for anything in return." I said, "Yes." She said, "He freed me," and said it again, quietly, as if the repetition was doing something, settling the information into the correct interior place, making it real in the way that information sometimes only becomes real when you say it twice. She looked at the fire for a long time. Something was working through her face that was not relief, and was not grief, and was not the complicated gratitude of someone who has received an unexpected gift. It was something more specific than any of those, the expression of a person to whom something has just become clear that they did not previously have the vocabulary for, and are now finding, tentatively, that they do. After a long moment she said, in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely careful, "Does he know that I—" She stopped. She did not finish it. I did not finish it for her, though I could have. I looked at the fire alongside her and let her sit with the unfinished sentence and whatever it contained. Then she looked at me and said, with the direct, unhurried clarity she brought to decisions once she had made them, "I would like to speak with him." I said, "I can tell him you've asked." She said, "No, don't tell him anything. I'll find him myself." She set the release document on the table with the care of a person handling something she intends to keep. She folded her hands in her lap and looked into the fire for a moment longer, not hesitating, not doubting, just letting the decision settle into its proper weight. And then she stood and left the room, and I sat alone with the fire and the document and the quiet, and felt, as I had felt before in this house in recent weeks, something that had been closed for a long time opening. I was not in the library when she went to him. What I know is what she told me, and what I had occasion to observe in the days that followed. He was at the north window of the library with a glass of brandy he had not yet touched, looking out at the snow, which was coming down in the slow and certain manner of December snow that has no intention of stopping. The fire was well built. The room was warm. He was standing in the particular stillness of a man who is not quite at rest, but is managing the distance from rest as well as he has learned to manage it. She knocked, he said, "Come in." She came in. He turned from the window and looked at her, and she told me that something in his face went still. The stillness not of a man caught, but of a man understood, which is a categorically different stillness, and she said quietly, much harder to be the recipient of. She said, "I know what you did." He said nothing. She said, "I know you paid it, all of it including Treves' extension." A pause. "I know you didn't tell me." He set his glass on the window ledge with the particular care of a man giving himself a moment. Then he turned to face her properly. The full, gathered attention he reserved for the things that genuinely required it, the attention that made you feel the complete weight of being seen. He said, "I did not want you to be here because of a piece of paper with Treves' name on it." She said, "I'm here now. The paper is gone. I'm still here." He said, "I know." She said, "I came back. Tonight to this room I came to you." He said very quietly, "I know that too." She looked at him across the library, across the width of a room that had held, in the weeks of her presence in the house, the accumulating weight of something that neither of them had named and both of them had known. The fire was to one side of them, the dark snowlit window behind him, and the room was as warm and quiet as it had been on every evening she had sat in it, except that everything in it now felt different, the way a room feels different when the thing you have been moving around has finally been named. She said in the plain, exact voice that was entirely hers, giving the words precisely their weight and not a fraction more or less. I would like to stay, not because of a contract, not because of an arrangement, because I choose to and because I have believed for some weeks now, without quite having the certainty to say it until tonight, that there is something here worth staying for. She looked at him. He said, I would very much like you to stay. And then, after a pause, in the quiet, exact voice of a man who is being careful, because the thing he is saying is worth being careful with. I have wanted to say that to you for some time, and have been less certain than you seem to be about whether it was mine to say. I was not sure, I was not certain, that I had the right to want it. She said, you have the right. He said, yes, a pause. I think I'm beginning to believe that. They stood in the warm library in the December night, and the snow came down outside the window, and the fire held its light between them, and the thing they were doing was simple and enormous and entirely without the ceremony it perhaps deserved, which was, if you had been watching them for 7 weeks as I had, entirely correct. I will tell you the shape of the months that followed, because the shape matters. She stayed. The release document sat on the table in the East sitting room for 2 days, and then disappeared into the particular keeping place she had designated for things she needed to be able to find, because she was a woman who believed in accurate records, though not in making them the first thing you see when you come into a room. He did not proceed to a formal arrangement in the manner most men of his station would have used, with solicitors and announcements and the machinery of social expectation. The North did not require that of him and had learned in the years of the grief not to. Instead, he simply began to be present, and to be present more openly. He came to the dining hall for dinner. He came to the library in the evenings and worked at his own desk while she read at the window table, and they talked when conversation presented itself and were quiet when it did not, in the particular quiet of two people who have discovered that silence between them is not something that needs filling. He began to ask her opinion about the estate in a way that was informal at first and then habitual, not as part of any formal arrangement, simply because he had found, over the weeks, that her mind worked well on problems with both practical and human dimensions, and because asking her what she thought had become, without his planning it, one of the more useful things he did in a day. He told her about Isabel on an evening in January. He told her in the sitting room where they had established the habit of their evenings, without prelude, the way he approached most things that mattered, directly, without the ceremony that would have made the telling feel like a performance. He gave her the facts: Isabel's name, the illness, the particular winter, the shape of the loss. And then, after a pause, what was beneath the facts? That the loss had taken from him something he had not anticipated losing, which was not precisely the capacity for warmth, but the conviction that warmth was available to him. The belief that he was, at the level of his actual self, the kind of man who could be reached and who could reach back. He said, I understood that Isabel had loved me. I understood it completely, and I understood the loss completely. What I understood less well, what I think I did not understand until considerably later, was that the loss had taught me a lesson I had not signed up to learn, which was that warmth is something that can be taken. And having learned it, I became not cruel, I don't think, but careful, in a way that became, over time, more comprehensive than I intended. Elspeth had listened to all of this with the whole, unhurried attention she brought to things that deserved it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the plain and precise way, that isn't quite what happened. He looked at her. She said, you didn't lose the capacity for warmth. You lost the nerve for it. Those are different things. She looked at him steadily. The capacity is entirely intact. I have watched you for 3 months. You lend your horse to the groundskeeper's son on cold mornings and explain it as exercise for the animal. You sent wood to my room without telling me and without asking for any acknowledgement. You paid a debt that was not yours and freed me and said nothing, because you wanted me to be free and not to feel that I owed you a life in exchange for the freedom. She paused. That is not what a man without the capacity for warmth does. That is what a man does who has the capacity entirely and has simply become afraid to act on it. He was very quiet for a long time. Then he said, yes. That is precisely what happened. She said, you seem to be finding your way back to it. He said, I seem to be. He looked at her with the full, gathered attention. It helps considerably to be in the presence of someone who is honest about what they observe. She said, I find it is the only approach that has ever served me. He said, yes, I think you're right about that. A pause. I think you're right about most things as it happens, though I don't intend to make a habit of saying so. She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved in the particular way it moved when she was finding something genuinely amusing, but was deciding whether to show it. She said, I appreciate the restraint, Your Grace. He said, Aldrich. A pause. She said, Aldrich. They sat with that for a while, in the quiet January evening, in the light of the well-built fire, and what was between them was as clear and as settled as anything I have ever had occasion to observe in 31 years of watching the complicated interior weather of other people's lives. The weeks that followed had a quality I find difficult to describe precisely, but will attempt. Not happiness exactly, not yet the full, settled happiness that came later, but something like the early stage of spring before spring has committed, when the cold is still in the ground but the light has changed, and you find yourself looking at things you stopped looking at in November and seeing them again. He was present in a way he had not been present for 3 years. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, and the change in him did not announce itself in a way that the household could have easily named. But Mrs. Fenn noticed it. The groundskeeper's son, who rode the Duke's horse on cold mornings and had learned to read the Duke's moods with the accuracy of a person whose comfort depends on such reading, mentioned to the stable hand that his Grace had taken to saying good morning with what appeared to be genuine interest in the answer. I noticed it in my office, in the quality of his notes, which had always been precise, and now seemed to have in them something that was not quite different from what they had always been, but was somehow more. He was less alone, that was the plainest way to say it. The house, which had been inhabited by a man who had learned to fill a great deal of space by himself, was now inhabited by 2 people who had, very quietly and without making a project of it, stopped being separate in it. She was learning the estate. Not in any formal capacity, nothing was arranged or declared, but in the practical way of a woman who has been given access to the information and finds information useful, and who asked questions because she wanted to understand rather than to impress, and whose questions, I noticed when I was present for them, were remarkably good questions. He answered them fully. The first time he did it, the first time he sat across from her at the library table and talked for 20 minutes about the management of the eastern drainage without shortening the explanation or simplifying it for her benefit. I watched her listen with the whole-body attention she brought to things she was genuinely absorbing and thought. He is talking to her the way he talks to me. Which was the highest compliment I was capable of forming, and I was aware it said something significant about the position she had come to occupy without any of us having formally placed her there. February came, with its particular northern quality of cold that is technically diminishing but feels, on certain days, more committed than December. The snow on the grounds was old snow, the gray-white of snow that has been there for months and has compacted itself down and lost its early elegance, and the mornings were still dark well past 7. But the evenings in the sitting room were warm, and they were spending the evenings in the sitting room together with a regularity that was no longer notable because the household had absorbed it, the way households absorb the regularities that become part of their natural order. In March, with the first uncertain signs of spring beginning to appear in the kitchen garden, the cold still in the ground but the light shifted, carrying the quality of a season that is thinking about arriving, he asked her to marry him. He came to the library in the morning when she was at the table with the spring correspondence. He came in and stood beside the table, not making a ceremony of his arrival, simply arriving, and waited until she looked up. He said, I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to answer it the way you answer everything, without softening it in either direction, because I don't think I could bear a considered performance, and I suspect you couldn't either. She set her pen down. He said, will you marry me? She looked at him, the full, deliberate, complete look of a person deciding something that matters, the look I had seen her give to the release document, and to the lamp bracket, and to Hale's misdirected accounts. The look that was the opposite of impulsive and the opposite of hesitant, that was simply reckoning, entire and honest. She said, yes. He let out a breath. His bearing shifted, not collapsed, not diminished, but settled in the particular way of a person who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. He said, "Good." She said, "That's all." He said, "No." He looked at her with the clear, direct attention that was his own equivalent of her plain speaking. "You are the most remarkable person I have met in many years. You arrived at this house through circumstances that were, in every meaningful sense, an indignity, and you bore them with a grace I found, and continue to find, genuinely humbling. You set this household in better order than it has been in some time, without being asked, and without making a performance of the doing. You have disagreed with me on the subject of geological literature, on the optimal drainage of heavy clay soil, and on 3 separate occasions involving the organization of the estate's eastern pastures, and you have been right on at least 3 of those 4 counts. And I have been more certain every day you have been in this house that I would spend the rest of my life grateful for the fact that Barnabas Treve is a man of impeccable method and absent scruple, because without both of those qualities you would not be standing here." She looked at him for a moment in silence. Then she laughed, not the careful, considered response of a woman in a formal situation, but a real laugh startled out of her, warm and entirely unguarded, the laugh of a person caught by genuine delight at a moment they had not quite expected delight to arrive. He looked at her as though the sound of it was the best thing he had heard in 3 years. It very probably was. They were married in April, in the small stone church in Ashfin, the village at the foot of the hill below Cresthollow. The apple trees along the church lane were showing the first pale green of the year, cautious and particular, as northern springs always were, unwilling to commit before they had to, and the lane itself was muddy with snowmelt and new growth, and the sky above Ashfin on that morning was the washed blue of a day that has decided to be generous with the people below it. The church bells were old and low, and rang out over the village and the open fields beyond with the sound of something that has been saying the same true thing for 2 centuries, and has not yet found occasion to mean it less. It was a quiet wedding. The household staff were there, in their good clothes, wearing the particular expression of people who have watched something difficult turn into something right, and are quietly satisfied to have been present for the turning. Mrs. Fenn stood very straight with her hands folded, and her face composed in the careful way of a woman who is feeling more than she intends to display. The kitchen maid with the strained wrist was there, the wrist fully recovered, and stood beside the footman who had not managed to fix the lamp bracket in 6 weeks, and both of them looked as though they understood that they were watching something that mattered. The Ashfin tenants who had been told came in their good things, the women with their hair pinned up in the manner reserved for Sundays and significant occasions, the men with their hats held carefully in their hands, and their boots brushed to the best finish the lane's mud had allowed. The tenant from the North Farm was there, the one who had seen the Duke ride past his boundary wall in the pre-dawn cold of December, and had said nothing about it to anyone until I asked. He stood near the back and looked at the front of the church with the expression of a man who is adding a piece of information to a picture he has been assembling for some time. 2 of the Duke's northern neighbors attended with their wives, men who had known Cresthollow through the difficult years, and who had come, I think, not because they were required to, but because they wanted to see it, because they had watched from a distance as the hall shuttered itself, and had wondered for 3 years whether it would open again. And Mr. Harwick Penrose, steward and accountant and occasional conscience, who stood in the second pew with his hat in his hands and discovered, to his own considerable surprise, that he was having difficulty with his composure for the first time in several decades, and that the difficulty was the most welcome thing he had felt in as long as he could clearly remember. She wore a gown of soft gray-blue, not white. She had told Mrs. Fenn, with the cheerful precision that had always managed to be both slightly appalling and entirely charming simultaneously, that white was for young women who had not yet been instructed by their lives, and that she preferred a color that was honest about what it had been through. Mrs. Fenn had located the best gray-blue wool available in the county and had engaged the finest dressmaker in Whitmore, and the gown was simple and exactly right, and suited her in the way that things suit people who know exactly what they are and have stopped needing to present themselves as anything else. She wore her dark hair up, with a few strands escaped in the way her hair always escaped by mid-morning, and she carried no flowers. She had said she found flowers at weddings an anxiety rather than a comfort, because you had to hold them and your hands were already busy with the business of being married. Mrs. Fenn had found this response. She told me later, both impractical and entirely typical, and had said nothing further on the subject. He was already at the front of the church when she came through the door. He was standing with the vicar, hands at his sides, and he turned when he heard her footsteps on the old stone floor. He looked at her, and his face did the thing I had not seen it do in 3 years. It was simply, plainly, openly glad. Not the managed composure of a man who has decided what he may safely show. Not the careful performance of appropriate feeling. Not the blankness of a man who has concluded that feeling things where they might be observed is a vulnerability he cannot sustain. Just glad, entirely, freely, without reservation or management. The uncomplicated gladness of a man who has found what he had stopped believing was still available to him, and who is not, in this moment, going to pretend he doesn't know it. She saw it, I watched her see it. Something in her face, when she saw his, answered it, briefly and completely, before she composed herself for the ceremony. And the composition was not a suppression, but simply a setting aside for the moment, the practical management of a woman who had important things to do, and was going to do them properly before she felt the rest. The vicar said what was required of him. He said what was required of him, in the quiet and deliberate voice he reserved for the things he meant entirely. She said what was required in the even, clear voice that was entirely her own, the same voice in which she had told me she had found Hale's misdirection, and asked whether she had done right by the household, and said I would like to stay, and yes, without qualification or softening. He took her hand, and there was a brief moment in the old stone church with the April light coming in through the narrow windows, and the last echo of the bells still fading in the tower, and the whole of the village assembled behind them, in which he looked at her and she looked at him, and the two of them were simply and entirely where they were, as certain as anything in this world is permitted to be certain. I said at the beginning that I am not given to sentiment, and I have now proven myself a thorough and comfortable liar. Let me close with what is simply true, which is this. Aldrich Vane was a man who had been lost for a while, lost in grief, and in the particular silence that grief teaches when it goes on past its necessary duration, and in the cold that descends on a person who has decided, without quite meaning to make the decision, that they cannot afford to be warm again because they have already lost warmth once, and the losing nearly undid them. He was not at his heart a cold man. He was a precise man, and a capable man, and a man who held to a code he had worked out for himself, and did not require anyone to admire him for keeping it. And beneath all of that, he was someone who had been afraid, for 3 years, to let anyone pass the thing he was guarding. Elspeth Crail arrived at his house as a line item in another man's balance sheet. She arrived, this I know because I was there, I was at the door as herself, entire, unhurried, without apology, and without the smallness that the world had been working to teach her. She did not try to reach him. She did not try to be noticed or to make herself into the shape of something he might want. She simply moved through his house with the plain, honest competence of a person who has decided that her worth is not conditional on whether anyone recognizes it, and who is therefore not performing for anyone's recognition. And she reached him anyway. Not by trying. By being entirely and precisely herself in proximity to a man who had been surrounded by effort for 3 years and found in her its complete absence, and found that absence more compelling than anything the effort had managed. She reached him the way water reaches stone, through simple, sustained, unhurried presence, until what had been closed was no longer closed, and what had been cold was no longer cold. He paid a debt to free her. He did it without telling her, and without expecting anything, and without asking for the gratitude that an action of that size might have been expected to generate. He did it because it was what she deserved, and because he had determined that her worth was not a thing to be held in someone else's account, and because the only version of things he was willing to look at from the window of his library was one in which she was free. She came back on her own feet of her own choosing. She went to him in the library in the December night and said, "I choose to stay," and she meant the word choose in its full and complete weight, which is the weight that the word carries only when you have not always had use of it. The hall was warmer after that. I mean this precisely, in the way I mean everything I have set down here, measurable, real, in every sense I have the competence to measure. I am not a man given to sentiment. But I was there, and I am glad I was there, and I would not have missed a day of it.